I'm going to hand you over to Peter now to talk from the Canadian perspective.
Yeah, I won't stand behind the podium. Good afternoon. I always like talking in the afternoon because people are more docile because the carbs kick in. So let me just pull out my notes. The Canadian perspective, we've been at this for quite a long time. And I don't mean just from a knowledge mobilization perspective that we've been at it, but I think it's important in the work that you do that this has been going on for a long time. And so if we talk about the modern era, in the Canadian context, land-grant universities and service to farmers, adult learning, in the turn of the century, we're using the latest technology to get the latest findings out to people who could use them. And at that time, it was the automobile and the radio, right? So I think it's important to look at our histories, look at what we've been doing, look at how we can learn from our own practice and innovate from there. So I would say that the current movement around knowledge mobilization started effectively around the year 2000. And it started partly in reaction to the knowledge transfer, knowledge exchange process in healthcare, which was very much about a top-down, we do research, you use it in clinical practice. And I had the fortune of working at the Social Science Humanities Research Council of Canada for a little bit over 6 years. David Phipps was one of my colleagues when he worked at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And we coined the term knowledge mobilization partly to think about the more complex nature of what it actually means to take what we know and make it ready for other people to use so that they can create value and help solve the problems that they're involved in. And so really, it's at about the year 2000 that this formally got going. Because I wrote a program called the Community University Research Alliance Program, which was about funding the spaces in between community-based organizations and university-based researchers, the president of the agency said, well, you know a little bit about this, so you do it. And then, so I had the job as Deputy Director of Knowledge Products and Mobilization. It was the first one in Canada. And when we started, so Mark Renault, President Mark Renault at the time said, go across the country, talk to the vice presidents of academic, vice presidents of research, and tell them we're doing knowledge mobilization now, just to let them know. Yeah, that didn't go over very well. Most of them would cross their arms and look at me saying, how much more money is on the table? That's not our job. Except there were about half a dozen institutions that picked it up, York University being one of the first. David had the fortune of working with Stan Shapson, who was the vice president, I think, research, right at the time? Who was on the board at SSHRC and said, this is an important conversation. This will be part of our competitive advantage to create these relationships between our researchers and people who have problems, between community issues and our graduate students, right? So he saw it as part of his competitive advantage, not as something else to do, and supported it, invested it, provided angel funding to get it started before there was new resources that are emerging from it. So if you think about that over a 15-year period, you get to a point where not only is it a single institution in isolation that's doing it, but you see a growth in a consortium. I think Research Impact emerged from 3 universities, 2, right? York and University of Victoria, and is now 11, correct? Right. So there's this momentum that emerges. I left SSHRC when there was a change in government. I was recruited to the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, and they wanted someone to help them think through their strategy of how do we move research into policy and practice for children and youth. So what we've seen in terms of trends is that those areas where there are clearly defined problems and the traditional methods of simply reading articles doesn't lead to practice change, doesn't lead to program change, is that they're creating positions for people to do this work exclusively. And it's really ended up in 3 sort of categories. The first category is people who do it as part of a regular job on the corner of their desk. It's not so effective. They have people who play this role either as knowledge exchange specialists or knowledge mobilization specialists or knowledge brokers, and they do it full time, and they have some positive effect. But one of the trends that's happening in Canada is that entire organizations are now becoming knowledge mobilization organizations. They're becoming knowledge brokers. An example is the Ontario Problem Gambling Research Centre is about to change their name. They used to be, traditionally, for decades, they would receive money from one of the ministries of the Government of Ontario, which is one of the largest provinces in Canada, and they would fund researchers to do work. And eventually, the government said, well, you know, we actually want to have more control over what we fund. That's a trend in governments in Canada as well as elsewhere. So they were successful in lobbying the government to say, look, it's okay to fund this, but unless you create relationships between people where they're going to be able to use it, it's not actually a good investment. And the government believed that. And the whole organization is focused on knowledge brokering, on knowledge mobilization. So let me talk about, these are my notes, by the way, if you're wondering how, right? 2x2s is kind of my go-through. So let me talk about 4 things. One is there's a maturity that's starting to emerge. We went through what I would say was an enthusiastic, youthful growth stage where we just kind of ran around madly going, oh, let's mobilize over here, and let's mobilize over here. And there were some lessons learned from that, but it wasn't as systematic as it could be, and it wasn't as, we weren't learning from our failures. And that's an important piece. There's a maturity that's coming out, is that we try things, some of it works, some of it don't, we learn from it, we put it into the next iteration. So that maturity of recognizing that it's a complex system, that there are many players, that in moving from A to B, it's not a straight line, it looks more like a set of cycles, and we're starting to see those cycles emerge. Within that maturity, you see places like research impact, where universities are now approaching, and you might want to talk about that at some point here, David, is that they're seeing that this is part of their core service. It's not a nice to do, it's a must do. They talk about how the research process in isolation is redundant because so many other places do it. If we're not creating relationships between the people who are engaged in systematic scientific processes and those that can benefit from its utilization, what is our role within the community? And if you think about universities, I can't speak for the UK, but in Canada, they're often some of the largest organizations in the communities in which they are. They play leadership roles in multiple ways, not just at student teaching, not just in terms of research, but also in connecting to community to help create value. And so that's, I think, a trend that's coming out of that maturity. We created the Institute for Knowledge Mobilization as a crowd-funded idea. The forum in Canada was launched in 2012 as a project of my consulting company, right? So I teach at the university, I do consulting with a limited number of clients, and I try to help build capacity. And so I noticed something in my practice that no matter who I worked with, whether it was the Jet Propulsion Lab of NASA, or Transport Canada, or the Centers for Disease Control, or forestry, or fisheries, or early childhood education, or the intelligence community, or defense, all of the issues were the same. The specifics were appropriate to the specialization, but the organizational problems, the human interaction problems, the access to and being able to assess what we were finding were the same everywhere. So in launching the forum, we wanted to launch a horizontal conversation. And what was interesting is that people showed up at the table and they're saying, huh, there are 18 different sectors. These are people I wouldn't normally talk to, but I'm learning something from them that allows me to reflect upon my practice, and I gain access to ideas that allow for innovation within my operational context. That was really interesting to them. But what was even more interesting is how the community of people who participated said, this is so important that you can't own this, right? We need to create so we created a not-for-profit institute. It's a registered Canada Institute as a not-for-profit organization that is now in the process of focusing on capacity building. So the forum is about creating an extended community of practice across the country where people talk to each other on a regular basis, share their practice, share their ideas, share the things that they're involved in. And the intention, every year people are saying, we want to come, we want to be there. And year upon year, we're now in our 4th version. This year is in Montreal in May on the 14th and 15th in the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec, which is the new archives building, but it's Quebec, so it's right off the big party street of Saint-Denis, right, which I think is important. There are more sponsors that are coming on. The universities are coming on as sponsors. The publishers are coming on as sponsors. Government agencies are coming on as sponsors. Software companies are coming on as sponsors because they recognize there is an important conversation there. Kathy was both courageous and perhaps foolish when she asked me, said, do you think we could do this in the UK? And I was like, yeah, I think you could, right? And it started last year in London, and here we are again in Edinburgh. And I think the intention is to continue. But it's not standing there. David's been having conversations with Tamika, right? Tamika Hayden in Australia, who wants to lead the process in Australia. I'm going down at the end of September, beginning of October, to Colombia to help them think through of how they create this community of practice within Latin America, right? So it's really, that's, I think, a reflection of the maturity that's emerging from this. The other thing that's coming out in terms of maturity in the Canadian context is that the funding agencies have adopted this as a core practice. I wouldn't say 100% of them, but I would say the majority of them. David, would you agree with that? Yeah, they haven't, natural science and engineering, we don't need to do knowledge mobilization, it happens, quote unquote. But the network centers of excellence actually fund large knowledge mobilization network projects now. The Social Science Humanities Research Council include knowledge mobilization. They have partnerships. Right? There's a whole series of programs to be able to do this. The Canadian Institutes of Health Research have embedded it in their research program. You actually have to write about this before you get any money, and you have to do it. It's part of your evaluation system. You're seeing the grant systems within the provincial governments are starting to do this. Alberta Innovates Health Solutions has embedded it in their process. The governments of Quebec have embedded it in their processes and have become changing some of the charters of their large organizations to include this and include this capacity to include evidence in all decision-making processes and both reward it and make it a culture. So I would suggest that that's been a slow, incremental movement, and partly it's because people start seeing the advantage of doing it and the disadvantage of not doing it. And it's mostly because, for the reasons that are a little bit counterintuitive, is that a small investment in knowledge mobilization ends up with better processes operationally. They end up making fewer mistakes, and the mistakes they make are smaller, so they can learn more often and engage in incremental learning over time. And I think that's an important trend in the Canadian context. One of the other parts that are emerging is the creation of systems and networks to support people. So I'll give you an example of the Institute. So the Institute was crowdfunded to support the Forum. So the Forum is now in its 4th edition, so this year's in Montreal, next year's in Toronto. Please come, David. David's going to be the chair next year. The year after that, it's going to be in Calgary, or in Ottawa for the 150th anniversary of Canada. Then it's in Calgary in Alberta, then it's in Halifax in Nova Scotia, then it's in Vancouver. So the systems of saying we have the intention of continuing this over the longer term and of supporting a community of practice means that people feel like they can invest and engage with each other in that process. But what's interesting about that is that people are saying, we just don't want the Forum. So people who are in operational leadership roles within organizations at the Forum last year in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, said, we need a space where we can engage the Chatham House rule, right? You're allowed to use anything you learn, but you can't tell anybody where it came from. We need to have these kind of open spaces like Vegas without Twitter, right? Where what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, that they can talk about core issues. And this year we talked about core issues related to human resources. What kind of people do we need? What kind of training do we need? What sort of measurements do we need to include? What does compensation look like over time, right? What are the sets of integrated methods that we need to look at? We looked at issues related to professional development, the social construction of the culture, the development and support of relationships, the clarity of roles, different types of contributions that need to be recognized. We looked at gaps in funding, right, in terms of what are the money issues that we need to deal with, what are the resource issues that we need to deal with, how do we organize it in ways that are systematic and that we can reflect upon it and learn from it and improve our systems collectively. And that's an important piece in the Canadian context. There is competition, but it's healthy. I would argue that it's healthy competition because it's a rise to be better, as opposed to a negative competition, which is going, I win, you lose. That we're really, I think one of the major trends is a win-win focus where, I win, you win, and society wins. And I think that's part of the ethic and the culture that's coming out of the maturation of the system. I don't think it was always that case. I thought there was a lot of bad behavior. And in fact, there was a vice president of a major organization at one point, and he said, as long as you keep using that stupid knowledge mobilization term, I'm not talking to you. Right? Because there was a competition over semantics, whereas I think what's emerged now is people recognize that there are trends, that knowledge transfer and exchange is pretty dominant in healthcare in Canada, as well as translation, because it's in the Act of Parliament that created the institutes, but it's associated to knowledge management and knowledge mobilization and implementation and dissemination, and that these are all parts of what we need to do collectively to build our understanding and build our ability to make better decisions with the best of what we know, right? I think there's that coming out of the conversation. There's less of the focus on semantics and more of a sense of we're going to figure it out, but we'll figure it out collectively. And I think that collaborative spirit is part of the major cultural trend that's happened in the Canadian context. I think the other thing that's coming out that relates to that culture is a recognition that the systems and mechanisms that we've held very closely for long periods of time are broken or breaking. That our universities don't work the way they used to, or we thought they worked, so we need to think differently about them. We need to think about them as value and of some sort of collective public resource. I think the same thing is happening in hospitals. I was just on a panel with the CEO of the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, and we were fundamentally, I was really surprised when he said, we're engaged in using evidence to put ourselves out of business. We want to make sure that children and youth don't come to our doors because they don't need us anymore, right? That's our kind of long-term goal, which is a different kind of perspective than a lot of administrators would have said before. I think the same thing is happening within government offices, although the governance context in Canada is slow to change. We have in part of what we've struggled with in the Canadian context is a federal government where recently the Minister of Science didn't believe in evolution. Okay? Politics, right? So people get elected for all sorts of reasons, and it's hard to have a debate with somebody in a position who actually doesn't believe in the fundamental process that that we believe that creates a lot of the value. And so I think there's a shift that will happen over time. I come from a political family, and so we always kind of zoom out and say, well, this too shall change. And so I think that's one of the challenges that we run into. I think the other trend that's happening in the Canadian context is a planning to do more. I think, and maybe it's a Canadian, I'm not particularly humble. I mean, I'm fantastic, but, right? But I think there's a humility of being Canadian, of saying, okay, we've done some good things, but we can be better. And so there's, I think, a planning trend towards how do we be better, and how do we learn from one another? How do we learn from other sectors? How do we not confuse our roles and our functions with our identity? That our identity is actually a much larger concept than the things we do on a day-to-day basis as teachers and doctors and knowledge brokers. That's a function, and it's a function that helps create value, and that in our conversations with one another and in our challenge to try to find solutions to our most compelling and difficult problems, that we actually come as whole beings. And I think that's actually a trend, and you see it in what I would call the ethos or the gestalt, right? That sense of when people come together, they're actually talking about learning and sharing and respect and reciprocity, and less about my opinion beats yours. I think that's been a shift that's happened. I think it's really taken a dominant role maybe in the last 5 years, but I think it took a good solid decade of people kind of beating each other for people to finally say, okay, enough of that. How do we actually co-labor to build a system where we will all benefit? There are challenges, and in the Canadian context, part of the challenges are the fact we're just so damn big, right? There's only, 35 million people in this enormous landmass. We live next to an enormous bipolar neighbor. Actually, on either side. We have Russia on one side and the US on the other side. And so I think there are challenges just related to the scale of how we live, right? Like, when people say, I traveled by train by 5 hours, and I was like, I travel 5 hours, have a meeting, come home, right? I think there's a scale issue that we struggle with. There's some regional identities that we struggle with that, when we talk about a single country, I'm French, Canadian, and Irish. David is British. In fact, wasn't the name of the general in the planes Abraham Phipps? That was after. The other David, yeah, right. So there's these identity issues. It's an incredibly diverse. Toronto has, I think, 158 different ethnic groups right now. It's one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world. And so I think there are struggles related to the complexity and to the scale, but I think that what's emerging in terms of the trend in the culture is in part a reflection of how we recognize how complex it is and that no one has the answer and no one has all of the resources. So how do we attract resources in multiple ways? The part that's coming out of the Institute, as I mentioned, so the forum, and then we created this leaders roundtable for people to talk. And then junior people came to us and said, well, we need a place to heighten our, to further develop our schools. So we're working right now with the University of Guelph on a summer school, right? It's sort of a 3-day bucolic retreat near a veterinary college to learn more about this. And I think that desire to learn and to connect is, I think, one of the core pieces that are coming out of the Canadian context. So that's an overview. David, what would you add to that overview?
I think just that it's not all about the universities. The federal government and provincial governments, to a degree, have also invested, Peter said, in these knowledge translation or mobilization organizations. Things like the Mental Health Commission of Canada, which had $250 million and got renewed, I think, with a big knowledge translation mandate. The Canadian Partnerships Against Cancer. In Ontario, the Institute for Work and Health, Ontario Problem Gambling. So we're seeing these discipline-focused organizations with a very embedded KT or KMB mandate within them. And I think that creates real opportunities for the universities to then rebuild our capacity as service providers, but then create linkages to these other knowledge translation organizations that we can engage in disciplinarily with our faculty members. So I think it's been the parallel growth at universities as well as in the non-academic sector that has really created a marketplace for knowledge mobilization.
Absolutely. I think that some of the risks that are emerging, there's lots of young people that want to rush into jobs that don't yet exist, right? So there's people every day that say, I want to do what you do. Good luck, right? It takes time. So I think that the system is emerging from it. Kathy, how are we doing for time? Okay, so what I'd like to just do is, so that's a really broad overview. It's hard to talk about a country so big as Canada, but I think that gives you a flavor of some of the major trends that are happening in the Canadian context. Are there questions? Yeah. Yeah, Monica.
Monica is new to the system in Canada, and I'd be really interested to see your perspectives as someone just coming into the space.
So some of you might know that my work is looking at competencies and skills. And for me, it's the granting agencies, the researchers, the universities are saying, we need to do something around knowledge mobilization. As a graduate student, I'm like, well, what does that look like? And I've been fortunate to be partnered with core mentors, including David, including you, who have done this work, are engaged in this work, but it's not enough to be one of 223 graduate students in one program, and I'm the only one who understands knowledge mobilization, practice, and theory. So my work is kind of figuring out, well then, how do we do this more systematically at a graduate student level, because we know that it's important, but there's no systematic approach in getting our newest researchers involved in the practice. We know that later on our grants involve it, but we don't have necessarily the explicit training in engaging in this type of work.
And maybe one of the things that you would want to do, Monica, and I'll challenge you to this, is to open up a graduate student caucus meeting at the forum in Montreal that you're going to. Yeah? Okay. Okay. We'll create space for it. And I think that, but that's an important piece, is that often people are coming, you know, institutions are saying we need to do this, and they assign a single person in isolation. And that's why we created the forum, so that single people in isolation can come together and be part of a larger community practice. Okay, other comment or question? None? Excellent. I covered it all. Okay, good. Does anybody want to know about some of the problems? So so some of the huge issues are, there's lots of bad social behavior that gets corrected, right? So people insist on maintaining their reward systems. And so one of the biggest challenges is, for instance, in the academic community, they have to write up their knowledge mobilization plan, and their knowledge mobilization plan looks like everything they've always done that has been proven not to be particularly effective. Right? And changing that culture is really hard. So at the disciplinary level, at the institution level, there's structures that are being created, right? So David works in this kind of meta level at York University that overrides everything. But when you drill down into the disciplines, the individual researchers or professors are still having a hard time with this concept of knowledge mobilization, because their reward systems are not set up for it. Right? I was at a recent graduation in a Northeast college in the US, and the head of the public health department said, look, you publish in the following 3 journals, that's all you do, everything else is a hobby. Right? And what he was saying is, here are the hard and fast rules of the discipline that you belong to, and if you want to progress in this discipline, here are the rules you need to follow. That's going to be, I think, a tough nut to crack. That's going to be one that's going to take much longer than 15 years, because it took much longer than 15 years to develop. It developed over hundreds of years, right? So that culture change may come about, but there's another discourse where we're saying, well, maybe it's actually not their job, right? As they have clearly told us, maybe it's not their job. And I think that's partly where the role of the intermediaries are coming in, where the government agencies are saying, we can't really incentivize this because we're a small part of their incentive structure. We need to create support structures as well. The other challenging thing is people, government agencies, organizations, institutions, expecting the change process to happen within their short-term strategic plan, right? They expect the system to change within the next 3 years. Who's been involved in massive system change in a 3-year period? Anybody? No one? Right? So they write these strategic, I do a lot of work around strategy, strategic thinking and strategic planning. And so they'll write in, we will change the operations of our discipline or sector within the next 3 to 5 years. It always it never happens. And one of the negative things that happens, and I've seen organizations drop off where they say, we tried it, it didn't work, we didn't get the changes we want, we're going back to business as usual. Right? Because they don't recognize how hard it is, and they don't recognize that they actually need the partnerships and relationships, and they need to build the skills to maintain and develop those relationships over time. And some of them actually drive themselves off the cliff, right? We see lots of organizations that fail. Recently in Toronto, the Women's Health Network couldn't get past their traditional mode of operation, and when the government cut their funding, instead of doing what the Problem Gambling Center did and redevelop their themselves in knowledge brokers, the board just said, okay, we're closed, we're done. And so 25 years worth of work disappeared, right? They don't even have a website to support it anymore. right? So it's not, I wouldn't say it's all rosy, but I think that we learn from these processes. Okay, that's it, right? Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
That's fantastic, Peter. Thank you very much indeed. I've had the privilege now of going over to the Canadian Knowledge Mobilisation Forum twice. I'm also going to the next one in Montreal next month as well. So if you thought this was fun, then that is at least as much fun as this one. So if you do get the opportunity to go in the future, I would recommend it.